the greatest threat to them is peacetime and governance and having to govern in peacetime. It's a gift to them to now be battling the US and Israel. This is what they wanted. And it means that they can blame the US and Israel for all the ills that people are facing, whether that be fuel shortages, electricity shortages, food prices, all of those kind of things. And they can then say, this is because of our foreign enemy, and this is why we need your support, and we're doing it for the Palestinian cause.
How can I help? How can I be useful in ending needless suffering? Do not be afraid of work that has no end.
We have to organize a social movement.
We have an opportunity to lead by example versus just talking, hot air. I think the more people in this fight, the more we grow. Eventually it could change. The people are the ones that can make the change.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Hope you're ready for another episode of Change Agents, an Ironclad original presented by Firecracker Farm. Now, let's dive in. Out of all the places and things going on in the world that you could report from or report about, how did you stumble across Yemen? What got you interested there?
My background was in racehorses and horse racing. And I spent, nearly 13 years riding and training racehorses professionally in the UK and Ireland. But my late father worked in the Middle East all his life, since before I was born, and mainly Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Bahrain. And so I always had an interest in the region. I mean, he used to send me postcards from all over the place when he was traveling. I remember him sending me a postcard when he was in Kuwait during Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. And so, whilst I was very much involved in the horse racing world, I still had an interest in the Middle East. So, I decided to make a change shortly after my father died, actually in Morocco, when I was in my 20s. And I'd always wanted to do journalism when I was at school. And so I was just told I was not smart enough and too dyslexic. And so off I went to riding racehorses instead. So I went back to plan A, really. And I wanted to be in the region doing the journalism that I wanted to do, but I just didn't want to be somewhere where there were loads of journalists. And it turned out there were very few journalists in Yemen. And I started doing Arabic classes when I was still in London, doing a journalism degree. And then I took myself off to Yemen before I'd even, I missed my graduation ceremony from the university and was already in Yemen by that stage.
Skip the pomp and circumstance. You're just getting down to the practical roots of the job. I get it. How many times have you been there?
Oh, well, I lived there permanently for 4 years. And so from 2010, I first turned up in Yemen in September, October 2010. And then I left at the end of 2014. So after the coup had already happened by that stage. And then since then, I've been going backwards and forwards. But that's been really hard over the last 10 years because access has been really challenging right from the beginning when Saudi Arabia started controlling the airspace in March 2015. And I had to go in by boat 3 times. I did that journey from the Horn of Africa, from Djibouti into Aden. And I'm not great on boats. I get seasick very easily.
That's not the calmest water either.
Yeah, I mean, they don't call it the Bab el-Mandab, which is the Gate of Tears in English, for nothing, right? But I got very lucky. I took a lot of tablets to not be sick. But actually, every time I did that crossing, it was like a lake. It was super smooth. And I met another crew who did it, and they had a kind of Royal Marine on the boat with them as their security guy, and he was seasick the whole way. So, or an ex-Royal Marine, I should say. So it's a notoriously rough crossing. A lot of people, humanitarian workers who were doing that journey at the time, getting into the city of Aden, which was under siege when I got in there, didn't even want to leave when they were given leave. They would rather stay in a city besieged and under fire than do that crossing twice in the space of 3 weeks. So yeah, it's become really difficult. And yeah, I've been trying to get back there again. Most recently, I thought I'd be back in January. My visa didn't come through. I thought I'd be there in April. I was then looking at trying to get to Sana'a directly, and I'm kind of glad I didn't, because, yesterday, 3 Yemeni aeroplanes were destroyed by Israeli airstrikes at the airport. And once again, as I haven't done many times in Yemen, I would have been stuck there, because getting out can often be as difficult as getting in, as I found. And so oftentimes since 2014, I turned up and stayed with Yemeni friends and said, I'll only be here a week or two, and still been there sort of 2 or 3 months later.
Wow.
And yeah, I'm not the greatest house guest in that way. Because,
from a time perspective. Honestly, it's in the Western world, I'd be shocked if the vast majority of people could find Yemen on a map. I'm familiar with the area due to the time that I spent over there. No time in Yemen, though. I just was peripherally familiar with kind of the neighboring countries. When you're talking from people from the Western world, I mean, obviously, this is something you are deeply passionate and invested in, that particular area of the world you're reporting there. How do you explain it to them in a way that captures their attention? Because we live in a world where you're going to get bombarded, especially if you have a anxiety device, which is I call an iPhone, an anxiety rectangle, where you're bombarded by everything in the world. How do you explain to people that what's going on in Yemen matters and it has consequences outside of just the borders of Yemen themselves?
It's really hard. I think also because most people are familiar with Yemen for 2 reasons. The first of which was Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula for many years. And now it's all about the Red Sea. Mm-hmm. And people don't know anything about Yemen other than those 2 things. It is important at the moment because of the Red Sea, because of what the Houthis have been doing in targeting vessels going through the Red Sea since October 7th, 2023. But really for me, I suppose, I've got, a real deep attachment of it. It's part of my identity now. I spent 15 years covering Yemen and pretty much only Yemen most of the time. But yeah, it's a very unique place, and it's not, probably most people would think, it's all desert. It's not like the most densely populated part of the country on the western side. It's all mountains, very green when the rains come sort of 3 times a year. And and Yemenis themselves get a huge bad rap as well, because the association with security issues. So with Al-Qaeda and with now, kind of the Houthis. And yeah, I suppose anecdotally, if I was to describe what Yemenis are like and mean to me, it's probably from one of my many unusual journeys, put it that way, in Yemen over the years. And in 2016, when I was going in, the airport in Aden, where I was due to fly in, got shut down because of fighting around the airport. And the only other way in, I was already booked on a flight and I was already in Jordan, was to go up to an airport in the northeast of the country in Sayoun. But that meant the Yemeni, the state airline, was putting on a bus to take you then 500 miles from Sayoun down to Aden once you landed. And unfortunately, at that time, Al-Qaeda controlled probably about 450 miles of that 500-mile stretch, and the main city in between, which was Mukalla. So Yemeni had said to me in Jordan, you can't get on the plane because you're a foreigner, and we can't be responsible for you then getting on that bus and going, and what was an 18 to 20-hour bus drive through Al-Qaeda controlled territory. And I said, listen, I'm happy doing it. I'll sign a disclaimer. So I wrote out my own disclaimer. And when I landed in Sayoun, somebody randomly turned up with the same disclaimer translated into Arabic. I signed it, and off I got on this bus, all with Yemenis. Obviously, I was the only foreigner on it. And as we went in through all these Al-Qaeda controlled checkpoints, at one point, they came on to actually check the people on the bus, not just to kind of check the driver. And I'm with a bus of, 40, 45 Yemenis who didn't know me from Adam until we got on that bus. And, along the route, we're stopping for meals. We're all getting to know each other as you do on kind of bus journeys. And at one point, I think it was 2 guys, Al-Qaeda guys, got on the bus to check people, and then it's segregated. So, of course, I'm sitting with the women. I'm in black abaya, in niqab, and basically traveling as a Yemeni woman. And I was sitting next to a Yemeni woman who I'd been chatting to for the hours that we'd already been traveling. She wasn't wearing a veil, so she was staring out of the window so that the Al-Qaeda guys wouldn't see her. But when the guy got on the bus, she just grabbed my arm and she said to me, "Don't speak English." And I was like, yeah, no shit, you know.
Hot tip for the day.
Yeah, exactly. But she didn't let go of my arm, so she's hanging on to me. And the guys get on the bus and they go down. One goes down to the far end to talk to the men who were sitting at the back and obviously check IDs or whatever. And the one other guy stands right next to me, to the point that, you know, the muzzle of his AK-47 was banging off my seat, and he was wearing like a mao, as they call it, so like a sarong, I guess. And I could literally count the hairs on his legs. And I was at that point trying to resist my natural instinct, which was to shout at this woman or to sort of get her off my arm, because I was struggling to feel my fingers. And but she was so terrified that we were going to get rumbled, or I was going to get rumbled, that she didn't let go until they then got off the bus. And we had, I don't know, probably 100 of these Al-Qaeda checkpoints to go through. It went on and on and on, until at one point the driver shouts out the window after we'd gone through the checkpoint, "I hope you all rot in hell," to the Al-Qaeda guys. So I was like, not now, not now. And after our 18 hours in this bus, we finally get to the last Al-Qaeda checkpoint going into Aden. And we pass through it, and the whole bus gets up and cheers, because they'd smuggled me through for 500 miles, and they all saw it as a great achievement. So, yeah, I mean, Yemenis get a really, you know, they're all, the kind of associations that are made of them are with Al-Qaeda, with terrorists generally. And for me, the better representation is that those 45 people were in that bus that all looked after me. They didn't know me at all, could have all ended up being taken by Al-Qaeda just because of me, because I was the white person on that bus. So yeah, they're a far greater representation of Yemenis in Yemen than the two guys who got on the bus with guns were, you know. And I, in many respects, owe my life and my safety and survival of doing everything that I've done in Yemen over the last 15 years to Yemenis who are just like that. And the majority of Yemenis are like that. They are extremely welcoming. They will do anything and everything they can to look after you and keep you safe. And that doesn't really mean they're important to everybody else, but just to kind of try and brush off that kind of label that they will often get as that's everything associated with terrorism and nothing great. But the reason, you know, kind of, I suppose, to go back to your question, really, the reason why Yemen is important at the moment to everybody else is the issue of the crisis in the Red Sea and the Houthis, who started launching attacks on what they initially stated would be Israeli-linked vessels in November 2023 in response to Israel's attack on Gaza, which was obviously a response to the Hamas attack on October 7th. So the Houthis then spent the next year targeting commercial vessels in the Red Sea, and that forced the majority of cargo vessels going through that route, which is a huge maritime choke point, the Bab el-Mandeb, and meant them having to go round the much longer route that takes more than a week longer, 2 weeks longer if you're going into the Eastern Mediterranean, round the Cape of Good Hope and around South Africa in order to deliver cargo. So it's economic, really, in that respect. But that's kind of, they're massively escalated because the UK and the US then started launching airstrikes against the Houthis because of these attacks on maritime vessels in January of last year. And the Houthis were very clear that this was, for them at least, connected to the war in Gaza. And they kind of, in some respects, became the hero of the hour, certainly for many people in the Arab world, because they were seen as the only, well, they're not a state, but the only armed group, let's say, in the region that was standing up for the Palestinians and standing up to Israel. I mean, it's really an indication, I suppose, of the lack of action of other states within the region to to try and halt what's been happening in Gaza, that the Houthis have become the kind of hero of the hour to many people, including to Yemenis who fought them for 10 years, who still now support them in what they're doing in carrying out ballistic missile attacks against Israel and attacking US warships in the Red Sea and British warships in the Red Sea, because the Palestinian cause is close to people's hearts in the region, as you would expect it would be.
Can you talk to me, in your 15 years of experience with Yemen, how did the Houthis rise to the position that they're in now? How have you seen that in the time, the decade and a half that you've been covering the area?
Well, the Houthis really started out of a youth movement in the 1990s, and it was a religious revivalist movement for the Zaydis, who are a branch of Shia Islam, which is unique to Yemen. And there are various reasons for that youth movement beginning and its kind of evolution into what became the Houthi movement. But a large part of it was about the spread of the branch of Sunni Islam from Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia funding a particular religious school right in the heartland of Zaydi Shiaism in northern Yemen, in a place called Damaj. And that was where the first fighting, really, when the Houthis started to sort of form and push back, was against that religious school in Damaj. And so that was in 2004, was the first war the Houthis had against the Yemeni government at that time. And actually, there was a connection to the US ambassador in Sana'a as well, because the Houthis had adopted this slogan that they've now become so famous for, which was, and still is, death to America, death to Israel, damn the Jews, victory to Islam, and started chanting it. And they started chanting it in Sana'a. And the American ambassador raised it with the then President Ali Abdullah Saleh, and he took his objection, obviously, straight to Hussein al-Houthi, who was the founder of the Houthis. And that really was what kicked off the first war against the Houthis, the first of what became 6 wars. But Hussein al-Houthi, who founded the Houthi movement, he was killed in that first war in 2004. And the current leader, Abdul Malik, is his brother. So, yeah, over the next till 2010, there were 6 wars between 2004 and 2010, an insurgency by the Houthis, but very much concentrated to their kind of homeland in Sada, which is right up against the Saudi border, so the most northern part of northern Yemen. But they've gone from this ragtag militia, which is what they started at, to now running a state. And there's been 2 kind of crucial points in that evolution that have made that possible. The first was them actually then becoming allies with the former president, Saleh, who they'd fought against in these 6 wars, because Saleh lost power in the Arab Spring, in the revolutions across the region in 2011. And he was then looking to claw back power. And so he did a deal with the Houthis, and in 2014, they were able to start taking territory, creeping further and further south until they got to the capital, Sana'a. And I was living in Sana'a at that time. And there was initially some fighting around one military camp on the edge of the city, but they were able to take the parliament, the Ministry of Defense, and the Ministry of Interior without a shot being fired, because they'd done this deal with their former enemy, the former President Saleh. So that made it all possible for them to make that initial move, which was seizing power at the end of 2014. But then what's got them to where they are today, which is firing anti-ship ballistic missiles, anti-ship cruise missiles, firing missiles at Israel, has come from support from Iran. And it's become a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because it's something the Saudis previously complained about. It was something before, way back in 2004, that the former President Saleh complained to the US about, was that the Houthis were a proxy or supported by Iran. And at that point, there was some political support, and there were people going from Sada, from the Houthi movement, to political meetings in Tehran or in Beirut. And later on, there was some small arms transfers. But once the Saudis launched their bombing campaign against the Houthis in 2015, when the Houthis had taken control of the capital, it was really then that it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that was when Iran started heavily supporting the Houthis with arms transfers, training, Iranian Revolutionary Guard personnel being in Sana'a to help the Houthis in training, in building their own weapons, in, building new drones, in creating this arsenal they've now got that has made them such a threat to international trade through the Red Sea.
Does Iran acknowledge the fact that they have provided this support, or do they sit back and go, we don't know?
It's kind of come and gone over the years. There's been a lot of I don't know. Yeah. There has been a lot of I don't know, and they there's no shyness in the sense that the Houthis are very much part of the axis of resistance and have been for some years now. But there's always a kind of element of deniability in the sense that the Houthis, these are their own weapons. We're not sending them this, that, and the other. But at the same time, they wouldn't deny that they are allies and partners in that respect. And I think it's always a mistake to call the Houthis a proxy of Iran. They're not. And they have changed a lot because of Iranian influence, even in their religious sort of beliefs and teachings. I mean, they're now recognizing sort of elements of the Shiaism that is prevalent in Iran, 12 Shiaism, more than they are even with Zaydi Shiaism. So they've kind of skewed some of their religious elements because of Iranian influence. But, there's certainly a strong indications that Iran did not want them to take the capital, Sana'a, back in 2014. And that they did not want them to start attacking vessels in the Red Sea. And the Houthis did it anyway. And so the Houthis are, their own people at the end of the day, and they will do what they want in that respect. But they're able to do it now because of Iranian support.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard me talk about Firecracker Farm and their hot salt. You probably heard other people talk about it as well. If you haven't tried it yet, let me just tell you, you're missing out on some serious flavor. Their hot salt is delicious, and it really makes pretty much anything that you put it on even more delicious. It's hot, but when you use it in moderation, it's not too hot, and the flavor that it adds enhances without overpowering. It is handmade, super premium, and comes in awesome stainless steel push-button grinders like the one I have in my hand right here. You can take them anywhere. Hot sauce, if you've had this experience, can very easily overpower other flavors and always runs out quickly when it's good. Hot salt lasts and lasts. The push grinder holds over 500 plus pumps, and when you consider the refill it comes with, it's thousands of servings, and it's a great deal and a lot cheaper than the sauce. For those of you that like flavor but hesitate because it might be too hot, you can mix it with sea salt to tone it down and still enjoy the awesome flavor. In my personal experience, you can modulate how much comes out of the dispenser. You're in total control of the amount of heat you serve yourself. So if you would like to support our show and give Alex and his family business a shot, head over to firecracker.farm and use the code Ironclad to get a 15% discount on your first order. You will be very glad that you did. Firecracker.farm. How are the, you mentioned the missile strikes and the U.S. and the United States, whether they're working independently or, joining forces on targeting. Is it having an impact? Is it deterring the attacks, or is it actually feeding into the Houthis' narrative of what they're trying to do, what the Houthis' actions are based upon are legitimate?
I think you have to understand with the Houthis, I think just from a Western perspective, we just don't get this and we can't get our heads around it. But the Houthis want war and they need war to survive. The greatest threat to them is peacetime and governance and having to govern in peacetime. For various reasons. I mean, they have a belief system of where they prioritize both positions and money to people who can trace their lineage to the Prophet Muhammad, which the Houthi family can. And so there's the kind of, almost a building of something like the British aristocracy sort of system, or class system anyway. And that means that, during peacetime, that becomes an issue, plus corruption becomes an issue. So back in September 2023, just before the Hamas attack in Israel, the Houthis were facing their first street protests and unrest against them because they've been at peace effectively pretty much since March 2022 when the Saudis stopped bombing them. So ideologically, their greatest enemies have always been Israel and the US. So it's a gift to them to now be battling the US and Israel. This is what they wanted. And it means that they can blame the US and Israel for all the ills that people are facing, whether that be fuel shortages, electricity shortages, food prices, all of those kind of things. And they can then say, this is because of our foreign enemy, and this is why we need your support, and we're doing it for the Palestinian cause. And in terms of having an effect on them, certainly there were no indications that they did last year. The bombing campaign that happened under the Biden and Rishi Sunak Prime Minister in Britain last year had any impact on them. There has been some indication with the more aggressive bombing campaign under President Trump that there has been some reduction in Houthi attacks on the USS Harry S. Truman and the US warships in the Red Sea, but they've still been attacking Israel. They've still been, firing missiles and got very close to hitting Ben Gurion Airport in the last few days, and managed to get through Israeli defense systems. So they haven't been degraded, I would say, and they haven't been deterred either. So, and most importantly, they hadn't actually carried out an attack against any merchant vessels in the Red Sea since last October. And the most recent one, and this is not on my data, this is the joint maritime data that's collected by the US and the UK and their reporting mechanism. The last one was against a US supply ship to the aircraft carrier in the Red Sea in November of last year. Yeah, they were still targeting US warships in the Red Sea after that, but commercial shipping, they hadn't carried out a successful attack since October 2024, and an attempted attack was in November. So, which really begs this question when we're talking about stopping the Houthis from attacking commercial shipping. They had already stopped, and that didn't mean they wouldn't start again. And certainly because it's connected to Gaza for them, there was this kind of de facto ceasefire in Yemen when the ceasefire in Gaza happened from the 19th of January. So there were no more strikes made by the Houthis into Israel. There were no more strikes against US vessels in the Red Sea, and there were no US or British airstrikes over that time. So what we know from that is if there was another ceasefire in Gaza, it would also stop the Houthis. Stands
to reason. You mentioned that it's an interesting conversation point to the governance during peacetime versus wartime. The classic tale as old as time. It's not my fault. Look at what everybody else is doing to us. They're to blame for. My children use it honestly quite often. Nothing is really their fault, and they can just it's this finger machine gun that points at all the other things. And but you mentioned that they had their first. I don't want to say uprising against them, but demonstration against them, I believe was the term that you used. What's it like for Yemenis people living under Houthi rule? I mean, what does a day-to-day look like? Is it when they're at wartime? Is it a less antagonistic relationship? What got them to that point where they finally demonstrated against them?
It's become increasingly harsh to the point that now I can't even probably answer that question with much authenticity, because I don't connect directly with people in Houthi-controlled territory anymore because it's too much of a security risk for them.
Wow.
Because
even from an information, email, phone call, wow.
Yeah. Because the Houthis last year, they carried out a sort of mass arrests and detentions of scores of Yemenis working for INGOs, doing any work on human rights, sort of data collection, all that kind of thing. And then another wave in January. And they've had this sort of year-long campaign now of going after what they're calling a sort of circle of Israeli and American spies. And this has been sort of part of a sort of growing feeling of living in a police state. And that has, even more recently, they carried out a social media campaign telling people to say, if anybody asks you about airstrikes, just say you don't know. And so even when I'm speaking to Yemeni friends in other parts of Yemen, trying to contact people in Houthi-controlled territory to find out how many civilians were killed in that strike, which you think the Houthis wouldn't be worried about people knowing about, they just say, I don't know. And there is no independent media. Trying to get anything independently verified now in Houthi territory is really hard. I mean, from the very beginning, even as foreign media, you weren't allowed to report from there without Houthi minders. I did it twice, but it got me into a serious amount of hot water. And it, on another level, I know I've got friends there who are living relatively normally. Although obviously the new sort of air campaign made them extremely nervous about what was going to happen next. And they're well aware of airstrikes going off around the city in Sana'a, for example. But Yemeni women are no longer allowed to travel without a male guardian, which never used to be the case when I was living in Yemen. I've met with female Yemeni friends who've come from Houthi-controlled territory since 2015. And they sort of said, yeah, they have to have a male guardian to be able to go anywhere now. And so, yeah, they've had an increasing stranglehold on all channels of information and communication. And I just recently had a friend who, he'd grown up and lived all his life in Sana'a, and he's just got out of Houthi-controlled territory, and he's still too nervous to speak.
Knowing that,
if you ask him,
knowing that, and just the environment that you are describing, what level, let's just say you're able to get a visa to go back. If you were to rate it 0 to 10, 0 being not worried, 10 being pretty worried about, going back, what's your comfort level with your own personal security there? They'd have to know likely that you are a reporter, that you have reported in the past. The minder works while you're in the country. That doesn't work when you're out of the country, right? You could report whatever you want to. It might impact your ability to go back to that country. But how do you feel about your own personal safety, and how do you navigate that change of just the cultural shift that seems to be going on?
Yeah, it's difficult. And it's difficult because Yemen, we talk about Yemen now, and it's not one country. Mm-hmm. It hasn't been for many years. It's multiple statelets. And so it's different depending on where you are in the country, whether that is in Houthi-controlled territory or in Yemeni government-controlled territory or in the Southern Transitional Controlled Territory, which is backed by the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. And so it's different depending on where you are. In Houthi-controlled territory, yes, I'd have to go with the Houthi minders. They've got as every place in Yemen has got a full file on my history of what I've done and what I've reported on from Yemen. Mm-hmm. I'm an Irish national, and I think that kind of helps. But yeah, you're hedging your bets a bit. You're getting guarantees from people that you know and trust to a certain extent on the ground before you even think about doing it. And then you're weighing up about, is it worth it? Because as I said, even when you're going into Houthi-controlled territory, nobody's going to be able to speak to you freely. Because you've also always got your minders with you, and they're also well aware that anything they say that doesn't toe the party line is going to get them in trouble. So, except for in the instance when you've got, issues of an ongoing bombing campaign, when you think it might be worth it. For general reporting, it's probably not. No. I haven't been back to Houthi-controlled territory for many years now because of that. I concluded that it wasn't worth it because I couldn't report independently. People couldn't speak to me freely. And the worst thing the Houthis would probably do to me is chuck me in jail, but I'd be there for a very long time. And they torture people, and they've done that to journalists, including foreign journalists before. So, you've got to take all of that. So comfort-wise, it's hard to know. I'm very well aware now with Yemen because got away with, but because I've been doing it for so long, there's a real risk of complacency.
For sure.
And I'm well aware of that, which makes me, it's as boring as it sounds. I sit down and do my risk assessments every time I'm going to do particular journeys and or whatever else, as much as I I kind of joked about that crazy journey I did through Al Qaeda controlled territory. I was on my own then. I wasn't relying on somebody else, but I'm also well aware that people who work with me also carry a risk because of me.
Yeah.
And I'm leaving the country now and they're not. And that has had an impact on sometimes me having to change my mind in the middle of a reporting trip and realizing that I couldn't publish anything we just spent the last nearly 2 weeks working on because something had changed, events on the ground had changed, and the people that I was working with, it put them in severe danger. And you have to make those decisions. And thankfully, in those kind of circumstances, generally I've worked with editors that are really understanding because they've obviously put in time, money, and effort into all of that. And now, because I know Yemen so well, they'll nearly always say to me, "It's your call." And when I have made that call, and I've had to do it a couple of times, I've never regretted it. And actually, I've been proved to be right afterwards. But you do. It's not just about my safety. It's the safety of Yemenis who are working with me, because I can get on an aeroplane or get in a boat and leave the country. They can't. They're stuck there. And in Yemen, it's not just even the risk of going to prison. They'll either attack members of their family or they'll go after them directly. And that's not just in Houthi controlled territory. That's in the south as well. There's been incidences of that. So yeah, I'm very aware of that. And my concern is probably more about them than it is about me, because the risks are less for me.
If you were a betting person, what would you put your money on the line for the next 10 years of Yemen? What does it look like?
Until everything changed in the region over the last 18 months because of what happened with the Hamas attack and the Gaza war after that, I kind of come to the realization that the Houthis were probably going to be in control in Sana'a in Yemen for the rest of my life, likely. That there was very little chance that I would ever get back to Sana'a the way I remember it as when I was living there and go and sit and have tea with my Yemeni friends in some nice tea shop in the old city. That moment had gone and it wasn't going to come back. But now I'm not so sure, particularly when you see what's happened overall with the axis of resistance over the last 18 months. And the Houthis were effectively the last sort of men standing strong anyway, at least in that axis of resistance. And they are determined to keep pushing and not backing down, although, there's now this talk of a kind of a ceasefire between the US and the Houthis now. Which perhaps is an indication that they are willing to at least be more thoughtful on some things than you might expect them to be, or more pragmatic anyway. But yeah, I think with the Houthis, the biggest problem has always been the international community has underestimated them, always. And that's why we are where we are today. So I still feel, though, that Yemen is going to be increasingly fragmented. I think trying to view it as a single country is fanciful at the moment. You have different currencies, you have different tax systems, you have different banking systems. And I think there will probably come a time in that 10, 15 year period where eventually the international community will go, okay, this is no longer one state. And you have to remember, Yemen wasn't one state until 1990. So it's got a relatively short history of being a single state.
Yeah.
And in all intents and purposes, and in practice, it's not been one state for many years now. And I can't see that changing, certainly not in the next 5 years, probably not even 10. If anything, it's going more down the route of fragmentation than it is to being one country again.
Kind of a broad question, but few people have as much experience. Few Westerners have as much experience in that area of the world than you do, with the time and connections, personally, professionally, all of those things. Do you think that there is a realistic path towards peace in that region of the world? Or are we in a perpetual cycle of violence coming and going, proxy support? It's I don't even know if there's a precise way to answer that, but that area of the world has been fighting for quite some time. I'm just curious if you've ever seen any potential pathways or realistic path to stopping it.
I mean, I don't think there's probably wrong analogy here. I was going to say silver bullet for the whole region, because it's very diverse in its issues and problems. Mm-hmm. But I think we also have to take responsibility for our role in perpetuating a lot of that. I mean, the reason Ali Abdullah Saleh was in power for 33 years is because, the US and the UK and the West in general saw him as their best and only partner in counterterrorism. And that was their only real concern about Yemen. And again, our only concern now is about the Red Sea. So it's the lack of sort of thought out policy in general for the long term beyond these kind of reactionary security issues that come and go, that means that you're going to have this sort of constant state of instability when we're only interested in backing a power or an individual that meets our goals over the next, 4 years of a presidential term or whatever it is. And we're very short-term thinking and planning in that respect. And the Houthis is a very good example of that, of that lack of in-depth long-term thinking and nobody wanting to embrace complexity. And without complexity and without wanting to grab hold of complexity with two hands in Yemen, you're not going to get very far.
Yeah.
And one thing I would say, particularly with Yemen, is that they have, I find it slightly patronizing the way you've got kind of a lot of UN-sponsored peace initiatives or talks or whatever you want to call them over the years, when actually Yemenis have the strongest mechanisms for dialogue and conflict resolution that I've certainly ever come across, but arguably in the region, because they still are very much a tribal society. And I don't want to say that with a kind of with a patronizing sort of look at them. I actually think it's a real bonus. And it's only because of the word tribe that we often think of that as a backward thing. Yeah. If you look at it through the lens perhaps of community, but because of their tribal society, they have these kind of social norms and mediation that works really well at a local level. And I think, if the Houthis had been left to govern and the kind of tribal mediation was supported and engaged with, and that kind of type of mediation was used at a higher level as well, I think, you could, the likes of kind of UN peace processes could learn a lot from the conflict resolution methods that have been used in Yemen for hundreds of years, and they're still using now. I mean, a lot of the prisoner swaps have happened through tribal mediation with no connection with, international sort of attempts to get involved. And local disputes have always been resolved that way in Yemen. And it is doable. And I think if you upscale that and have just better engagement with people at a lower level, rather than putting all your sort of eggs in one basket with one person who you think can be your ally for the next 20, 30 years, you're only going to repeat what's already happened, in the run up to the Arab Spring in 2011, where you've got a sort of group of dictators across the region that whose, in many respects, greatest purpose was serving the interests of the West.
Kind of leads me to my last question for you today. If you were able to get the prime minister and the president of the U.S. in some room, whatever, they like, you know what? We need some advice on Yemen, but you realize you can only give them one piece of advice to maybe restructure how they think or how either of their country's foreign policy targets views Yemen. And they had to listen to you, by the way. I'll add that, because if I don't add that, we both know that they'd be like, yeah, whatever. So what would it be? What would you say to them? If I mean, obviously this is I'm trying to make a simple question out of an incredibly complex situation, but I'm just curious, what would your advice to them be, the leaders of the Western world?
I often bail at this question because I'm a journalist. I'm not a policy advisor.
Yeah.
But that's a bit of a cop out really, because it's really easy to throw stones and and criticize without actually being constructive in that way. And I'm not a policy advisor. I'm not an academic. I'm not a political analyst. I don't describe myself as any of those things. I got into journalism because I wouldn't stop asking questions, and I like to hear people's stories. So I think generally I probably say go home, stop bombing Yemen, and in its simplest form, in language that they might understand. I think being the journalist that I am, and this is one of the things that always got me into trouble at school, I would ask why. Why are you doing what you're doing now?
It's one of my
Explain
favorite
to me
questions.
why. I mean, I was always the kid that got in trouble at school for sticking my hand up and going, why all the time? And it used to drive teachers mad because they would give another explanation. And I go, but why? And so I would say, why? To what end are you doing what you're doing? What are you hoping to achieve? Why are you doing this? And what do you want to get out of it? Because if you're starting this process by saying we want to stop the Houthis from bombing shipping, well, they haven't done that since October last year. So tell me, why are you doing this? Because, I'd like to understand more about that. And I think when they thought that process through, they would go, why? Why are we doing this? And that might start to make them think a bit more about engaging in a some kind of better policy thinking, but also some better long-term planning that's not just revolving around, sort of either counter-terrorism issues as they were before, or sort of defense of the Red Sea, as they'd like to put it.
My worry would be in that room, if you ask them why, they would have to call aides in and turn to them and say, why are we doing this? Because they're the figurehead.
Yeah, and the lawyers as well.
Yeah, and honestly, the leader of a country is not intimately familiar with every particular single issue, even though I wish they could be. I don't know if it's possible, but they may not have the best answer for you in that room. They'd probably have to pull other people in. Why is my favorite question. It can be overused. Yeah. My children overuse it oftentimes when I'm asking them to do something and they just don't want to do it. But the answers are quite revealing, especially if you can't really give one because you don't know, which should hopefully, in my mind, drive you towards a little bit of self-exploration as to why you don't know. Again, you go back to this why.
Yeah, it's always very revealing, I think.
I think so, too.
That's why I always love it, even as a journalist question, is why? Because the answer or lack of answer is often the case, is always very revealing.
I agree. Well, I can't thank you enough for your time. Please promise me if you go back to Yemen, you will be exceptionally careful, because I'd love to have a conversation with you again when you return. No more crazy bus rides. Take your Dramamine. Save some for other people. It'll help them as well. But I really appreciate your insight and your knowledge and your experience.
No, it's always great to talk about Yemen.
Yeah. Well, until next time.
Thanks, Andy.
Hope you enjoyed today's episode. Thanks you again for listening to Change Agents, an Ironclad original presented by Firecracker Farm. I'll see everybody next week with an all-new guest and an all-new topic. See you then.